Hi, I'm Jacqueline Simmons, Senior Executive Editor of the Americas at Bloomberg in New York. And joining me in London is Joanna Place, Chief Operating Officer at the Bank of England, a position she's held since 2017. To be clear, she's been at the bank for more than 30 years, and previous roles include Head of Monetary and Financial Statistics, Head of Customer Banking, and before her current role as COO, she's Executive Director of HR at the bank. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you very much.
So I could explain your remit at the bank and how it relates to discussions of race and gender. You do a much better job. Can you give us a brief overview of your purview and how it fits into this broader discussion of diversity at the
Of course. So at a very high level, as Chief Operating Officer, one of my responsibilities is of the HR department, who lead our diversity initiatives. But it's really important to remember that diversity is a responsibility of every single person in the bank. So when I was HR director, I made it very clear that diversity wasn't just an HR issue, it was for everybody. And we introduced the inclusion strategy. So my role really is twofold. One is I'm the diversity champion of the bank, and that's part of my role as the Chief Operating Officer, but also as part of the executive team and as a member of the bank staff, we each have a personal responsibility to all forms of diversity.
Got it. So, Jenna, the Bank of England made headlines when it issued an apology this summer for the time its former governors and directors had ties to the slave trade. Can you explain the context, the timing, and events leading up to the decision to make a public apology?
Of course. So just to backtrack a bit in terms of a little bit of history, we set ethnicity targets along with our gender targets in 2014. And we've been working quite hard since then to meet those targets. And we've had various actions along the way. But that was really grounded in thinking of the present and also thinking of how we could improve things for the future. And I think recent events threw for all of us into sharp relief that actually in order to move forward, we also had to acknowledge the past. So we had to acknowledge the past and we had to apologize for the past because the past is actually part of resetting our agenda. It is actually part of that apology. So I think it was very important that we issued that statement. And in fact, we're going further internally by doing a review to understand what these connections were of our former governors and directors. We're removing any artifacts, paintings, etc., connected with them. And we're also looking a bit deeper into the indirect links that the Bank of England as an institution may have had with the slave trade. Albeit a long time ago, but it's very much resetting and looking forward, acknowledging the past.
But is it fair to say that the timing was stemming from the events of the summer after George Floyd's death here in the US sparked global protests? Was that timing not factored into your decision?
Absolutely it was. I think that is what threw into sharp relief for us, that actually all our efforts in terms of trying to improve and move forward, in order to do that, we had to reset the past. And I think that helped us understand that we had to reset the past. We have a very strong BAME network, our staff network in the bank, and we worked closely with them with this. And indeed, we're working closely with them with the review as well. And they work very closely with us in terms of all the actions we take to improve our processes, but importantly, improve our outcomes in this area.
The decision to remove artifacts and take down portraits of governors, one argument from places like museums, such as the V&A, is to keep up those displays and keep those artifacts up. But what you do is you say alongside that, you explain the truth about that past alongside those artifacts so that people understand the past. Was there any such discussion prior to your decision to remove those artifacts or portraits?
Absolutely. And in fact, we have got a museum attached to the Bank of England. So some of these artifacts were in actually the main building of the bank. And what we want to do, and again, working with our staff network, is to consider whether we should put some of those in the museum and whether it will be appropriate. But it has to be part of the narrative. It has to be part of the apology. It's acknowledging and apologizing for our past. So we're not ignoring it, but we are apologizing for it. And therefore, we're working with our staff network to see whether, when the museum is open, and of course it's closed at the moment, but when it reopens, whether it would be appropriate to have a display using those artifacts.
Right. The removal of these items begs a more existential question. Are apologies in these, moves to take down items attached to this period enough? Or does the bank believe that reparations should be looked at as part of the discussion?
Well, in terms of working with our staff network, we strongly feel that as well as acknowledging the past, we have to make the future better for our future employees. And that's diversity across the board. But we're working very closely with our BAME network to see how we can improve things. So, for example, we have about just over 4,000 staff. 20% are BAME staff or declare BAME, so that's quite a large figure. And we're proud of that. We're very proud of meeting our gender target below senior management at the beginning of 2020. But we're going to work with them to see how we can take things forward. So it's not just an apology of the past and then we can draw a line, not at all. It helps us move forward, and we've recently announced that our board will lead a review into what else we can do for our Black and minority ethnic colleagues. And I think that's really critical. So it isn't just a review of what to do with artifacts. It's actually very much grounding it in the present day and what more can we do? Because to be quite frank, we have set ourselves targets not only for below senior manager, but at senior management. The at senior management targets are challenging. We've had lots of outcomes, but they haven't resulted, lots of actions, but they haven't resulted in the outcomes that we really want. And therefore, we want to take a more forensic view of what more actions can we do? What more can we learn from other companies in order to really move the dial in this space?
Right. So it sounds like the review is more looking forward and about things you can do going forward for your Black, Asian, and ethnic minority talent versus having reparations of any sort to account for the past, if I understand you correctly.
Well, actually, there's two reviews, because there's the review into the past to really understand these links that our governors and directors may have had, and also that the Bank of England as a company may have had, in terms of, what did the bank as a company facilitate in terms of the City of London's role in slavery? What were the links between slavery and macroeconomic development? And once we have done that review, we will be in a better place to understand what acknowledgement, what apology I think we need to make. But you're right, we didn't think it was enough simply to remove the artifacts. We wanted to dig a bit deeper and understand what were the links, what were we as an institution responsible for.
And what's the timeline for the review?
That's a good question. We haven't got a specific timeline, but we hope to finish it before Christmas. It really depends on the other work related to COVID, but we're not dragging our feet in this. That's for the backward-looking review. The forward-looking review we've announced internally to the bank, and we've said it probably will be about 6 months. We want to make sure we get this right.
Before we move on to questions about the bank itself and the targets, as you mentioned, I want to just ask one more thing on this point. It was very notable in the apology that the bank said it was itself never directly involved in slave trade. And I wondered, why make the point about no direct ties, given the bank by default had a role of extending credit during a time when such funding could be used to support slave trade?
Well, I think when we put that statement out, and it may be that the review tells us something different, but we have said that we want to do the review. But when we put that statement out, there's a lot of histories written about the Bank of England, and none of them have suggested that we've had any direct links, but we have acknowledged that some of our governors and directors had links, which is a very personal thing for them. But also as an institution, we want to dig a bit deeper to see, as you say, what role we had in facilitating the City of London's role. Now, whether that turns out to be more direct than histories of the Bank of England have indicated, that's what we want to find out.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Bank of England's own targets. As I understand, you're aiming for 50% of employees below senior management to be female by year end, and 35% of senior management to be female in that same time frame. Will you meet those targets this year?
So I think it's very unlikely. And I think over the last year, our attrition levels have fallen significantly. So obviously we're doing less hiring. On the senior management targets, when we set them, our senior management was 17% female. That was back in 2013, and it's now 31%. So obviously we've made a lot of progress, and we acknowledge that we may not make the 35%. And our under senior management is approximately 46, 47%. So we may not meet the targets. And it's always a challenge to know whether to set a realistic and achievable target, so you can celebrate meeting it, or to set yourself a much more challenging target, so the outcome is actually better, even though you have to say, well, actually, we haven't met the stretch target. And we chose back in 2014 to set ourselves 35%. We knew it was a stretch, but we knew that it would really hold our feet to the fire, and that we would look at all the initiatives that we could possibly do to get there, which I feel that we've done. But the simple answer to your question, I think, is it's unlikely that we'll meet the targets. But I do believe that the outcomes will be significantly better than if we'd have set ourselves a slightly softer target.
I wondered if you could expand on a little bit, because one of my questions about the momentum in the face of Brexit, the pandemic, economies, is there a risk that these events end up masking the urgency of racial and gender inequity, because everyone is so focused on navigating these big macro forces at home, and especially since, as I understand, the UK suspended mandatory gender pay gap reporting this year, so that businesses were so busy with other issues?
So, I mean, I think it's a good question to ask. I think that what the crisis has shown us in the Bank of England, and I can only speak for the Bank of England really, is that it's shown us how important diversity is. So we have had this economic shock. We've had to think about our policy in a different way. We've had to think about our operations in a different way. We've had to respond to that shock. We've had to think about our own ways of working in a different way, something that we never expected to be doing in 2020. And what it's taught us is that having a diverse workforce has really helped us to look at all those things through different lenses. So we're not just looking at it through one lens of, oh, we've always done it this way, because we've had to change what we're doing. In terms of our ways of working, we've involved our staff networks. How can we work from home or come back from the office? How can we be more inclusive in meetings when it's on video or on audio, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, it's been fantastic having all these different points of view, because you inevitably get to a better solution. So whether that's to do with economic policy, or whether it's to do with, having a meeting where half of the people are in the office and half of the people at home, and how do you manage to do that? You've got all these different points of view. So it's made us be more innovative. I actually think it's made us realise even more the importance of diversity. And we've actually coincided the start of this pandemic, or the start of it in the UK, with having a new governor. So he also wanted to look at culture and about diversity and about inclusion. So we've had these two big forces which have really pushed us into, yes, this is even more important. And of course, there have been some opportunities in terms of inclusion. You're no longer tied to how many chairs are there in a meeting room and how many people can get in. And we've managed to have conversations, albeit video and audio, with lots and lots of different people, which has been tremendously valuable when we're looking at ways of doing things differently. I think the big challenge for us is, one of the big challenges is our attrition at the moment has gone down, as you might expect. So if we want to constantly increase increase our the diversity of our workload, that just gives us a bit more of a challenge. But it gives us a fantastic opportunity, I think, of doing things differently and hearing different voices around the table.
So is the attrition the reason why you think you might miss your gender targets this year?
Well, it's certainly a contributing factor. Our attrition's been a lot lower since March this year. Now, I can't say we would have definitely met them. If not, we were at 31% in March, and we're still at 31% female, and we have to get to 35%. It still would have been a stretch, but it's a contributing factor. There's no question to that.
Right. I wanted to ask just very quickly about your targets, because I asked you about gender, but I didn't ask about Black, Asian, and minority ethnic targets at the bank, commonly referred to as BAME in the UK.
Yeah.
But if I understand, your targets are 20% for that group of staff below senior management and 13% of senior management to be BAME by the end of 2022. Again, do you feel like you're on track still, or is that also unclear?
Okay, so in terms of our below senior management, our target is 20% by the end of 2020, and we've already met that. But in terms of senior management, we set the target at 13% by end 2022, and we're at 7%. So we've increased from, it was 2% when we set the target, and we're now at 7%. It's a stretch, there's no question about that. We will do everything we can to meet that target, but I think it's going to be challenging. But we haven't tried to change the target. We are still aiming for that.
Right. One of the things, before the death of George Floyd and the protest, so much of the conversation around diversity was so gender focused. And some executives, even now say that gender just feels like a safer issue to tackle than race. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think that's possibly true for us. A number of our initiatives were intersectional. So things like mentoring and sponsorship. We have a returners program where we bring people back in. We have unconscious bias training. But actually, to answer your question, about a year ago, we started talking with our networks about exactly that. Is it because people feel awkward in this space? So we introduced these workshops called Let's Talk About Race. And they've been fantastic because people have talked openly. I think a lot of people are very nervous about talking about it, or they're worried that they'll use the wrong words. And the Let's Talk About Race workshops, I think, has really helped to unlock a lot of that. And people have talked about how they were feeling. So people, for example, if people had a name that was difficult to pronounce, people would feel awkward about asking about how it was pronounced. And yet these people at the workshop say, no, actually, please do ask us. We have these incredibly open conversations. So I think it probably, to your point, was a bit more difficult for people to talk about. And I think workshops like the Let's Talk About Race workshops and us working closely with our staff networks has hugely helped unlock some of those issues.
Finally, I think that as someone who spends a fair amount of time thinking about these issues of recruitment, but also better representation, what's the number one thing the bank sector as a whole needs to do if it really wants authentic, meaningful, and sustainable change?
Well, it's difficult to say just one thing. I mean, I think the most important thing is role models, actually. I think a lot of people will say you can't be what you can't see. So I think getting senior leaders in, a very diverse senior leadership is really important. I mean, in order to do that, you've got to obviously build a pipeline. Things that we've done around blind recruitment has been really helpful. We introduced a career returners program recently for people who had been out of the workplace on maternity leave or indeed any other reason, and who were a bit nervous about coming back to work. And we offered them a 6-month contract because I think most people would be okay with 6 months, sort of try before you buy. That's been fantastic at getting more diversity in. Over 50% of our career returners last year were BAME, over 50% of them. So I think there's a number of initiatives, but I think when we really see the dial moving, it will be when we get a lot of senior BAME leaders, and that's certainly increasing in financial services, but it just needs to go further. So we've done a lot, but there's still a lot more to do.